Hey guys, what's up? So today what we're going to do is talk a little bit about progressive overload, okay? So what it is and what it isn't, and kind of what ways we should be thinking about factoring it into a program, okay? Because a lot of people, they kind of think of progressive overload and they think about how it needs to be part of programming in that it needs to fit in somewhere. But rather than just looking at it as a progressive tool that is to be used over time, people use it almost like an exercise, in that going training is synonymous with you needing to progressively overload for you to actually improve. And that's not quite the case, okay? So for anyone unaware, progressive overload is essentially your ability to create an overloading stimulus. So you progressing the stimulus that you've been using previously. And people typically think of that in terms of weight on the bar. Okay, it's typically more weight on the bar. But at the end of the day, it's progressive tension overload. And you guys have read some of the articles on muscle physiology where we talk about, actin and myosin and the sarcomere, etc. And that is where we are trying to progress the tension. So we are trying to progress the cumulative tension that we are putting there, as opposed to just progress the tension that is going on the bar, okay? And that has a couple of important implications as well when we think about it on that muscle fiber, sarcomere, individual muscle protein level. Like when we think of it like that, it gets a little bit different, okay? So if we start there and we think about what we're actually trying to achieve, so we're trying to progress the tension that we're placing on the muscle fibers, sarcomere, muscle proteins, etc. We're trying to progress the tension there. If we break it down to that microscopic level, and then we think about, all right, how many of those units or how much muscle is in something like a bicep versus the cumulative amount of muscle in a quadricep, glutes, adductors, lower back, i.e. the muscles that would contribute to your force production during a squat. And that's kind of what I want you to look at. I want you to look at the volume of muscle that is involved and then think about, all right, what is the actual potential for me to progress here? Okay, because when it comes to a bicep, all right, we've got a small amount of muscle and we need to progressively overload for sure, but how does that relate to something like a squat where we have a lot more muscle, meaning that the absolute weights that we are lifting are much heavier? So for example, if you were to progress your squat in a year from 150 kilos to 180 kilos, you would be pumped. You would be so happy regardless of how you got there. And realistically, if you were to break it down, you wouldn't have got there by having even jumps in load every single week throughout the 52 weeks of the year for you to add that 30 kilos to your squat. There were probably times where you went up a little bit, you plateaued, you had to drop down, you added up again, you ended up higher this time, you plateaued, you dropped down, that kind of stuff. There might be periods where you're not progressing your strength at all for whatever reason. Maybe training was inconsistent. That's what the real life person's training progression looks like. Whereas when we actually train, then we try to enforce this overload. We try to force something that isn't there session after session after session. Okay, and if we think about 150 kilos to 180 kilos, that is a 20% increase in the load that has been lifted. Okay, so 20% increase from 150 up to 180. Okay, and if we think about how that applies to something like a bicep curl, then imagine for 10 reps you're doing, let's just say 10 kilos on a bicep curl. Okay, strict dumbbell preacher curl, you're doing 10 kilos. That would mean, relatively speaking, since if you're satisfied with your squat progress, you should be satisfied with your bicep curl progress, that in a year, if you were to add 2 kilos, you should be delighted. Because again, it's that 20% increase. And that's not to say that that's not less progress. That is the same amount of progress. But because we think in kilograms and we think in, just at these absolute terms, we don't appreciate that progress as much because it doesn't seem impressive. all right? But it is just as impressive, and it is predictive of you building more bicep muscle mass, which is probably one of your goals. So that is a good thing for sure, and something you should be looking at and saying, oh, that was great progress, congratulate yourself, and fucking move forward and keep doing whatever you were doing to actually get there. Okay, because when we think in kilograms, it's much easier to get caught up in this idea of progressing far too fast, because we think about our whole body's potential to produce force. So we think about our ability to progress on a deadlift and on a squat. And time again, this will happen with female clients in particular. They'll be like, oh, my bench is stalled, my bench is so weak, my upper body's so weak. Like that's a very common complaint for females. And the thing is, yeah, okay, they do tend to have more muscle mass in the lower body, but it's also the fact that because they are less strong overall, like let's say they are only benching 30 kilos, then like a 3 kilo jump in a few months would be brilliant. If you jumped 10 kilos in a year, that would be a 33% increase in your bench press. Like that would be insane. Like that would be brilliant progress. Like that would be the same as a male who benches 120 kilos going from 120 up to 160, which would be fairly unheard of in a year. Okay, so that's why we have to really look at it from a relative perspective and then look at our potential to progress that way. Because the way we deal with kilograms, it's much easier to kind of push the concept of progressive overload on very heavy lifts than it is on very light lifts, because on very light lifts you're actually working with different tools. Okay, so it may be something like increasing a rep here and there, maybe adding a set, maybe increasing the weight by 2 kilos but having to reduce the load a little bit, unless you have maybe micro plates, for example. Because we have to essentially look at, all right, how quickly can I adapt to the stimulus that I'm applying? Like how quickly can I adapt and progress my strength relative to a 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 kilo jump? And that's obviously going to take much longer for something like a bicep. So if we're chasing progress every week, it's going to be tough to get there. Okay, and this is one of the reasons as well that you will see people talk about things like, oh, I'm doing my compound bicep exercises because they're better for progressive overload. I'm doing these heavy for progressive overload. And it's like, this just makes no sense. And what people mean by that is like they'll do a heavy bicep curl and they'll use a bit of momentum and they'll cheat it up because they can see themselves progressing faster on that. They could see themselves moving heavier absolute loads, and hence they get that illusion of progressive overload when it's not actually happening, because the human body doesn't have the capacity to adapt to stimuli as quickly as this person believes that it can. And again, it's all kind of skewed based on a misunderstanding of what progressive overload is. So progressive overload is not something you force. It is not something you force and then your body just decides to adapt. Like the ability to progressive overload, it is an adaptation in itself, because if you are progressing, you have adapted to previous stimuli. Meaning that 100 kilos that you squatted, that you trained with for the 3 weeks prior, the fact that you can now go to 105 tells you that you have earned the right to go there because you've actually adapted to that previous stimulus. What you'll see when you haven't actually adapted and you haven't actually progressed because your muscles, your nervous system, the general skill has not progressed, what you'll see is the person goes up to 105 kilos, but they change their technique. They move faster. They do something to change the actual stimulus so that it is more or less equal to the 100 kilo stimulus because they didn't earn the right to go there in the first place. So that's what we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about, have I actually earned the right to progress, or am I trying to force progression? Because I see this time and time again. And the people that try and force progression are the people that have sore elbows, sore shoulders, sore knees, sore hips, etc. Okay? And, there is a degree of it trickling down from high-level bodybuilders as well. People see, guys who are already squatting like 250 kilos, they're on loads of drugs, and they're adding 5 kilos to the bar every week. It's like, number one, the weight is heavy on an absolute perspective. Okay, so there's a heavier load, therefore any change in load from there is going to be relatively smaller for that person. okay? So them going from 250 kilos, adding 2.5 kilos to their squat, it's like that is a 1% increase for that person. It's nothing, which is why you see them go in the gym every time, and especially because they have that extra adaptive capacity from being on bodybuilding drugs. Then you see that person go in the gym and add 2.5 kilos every session for like 5 weeks or whatever. You see that, and then they end the training cycle and then they pull it back a little bit and then progress again. It's like, you see that and then you think, oh, that's what I have to be doing. And let's say you're someone who just started in the gym, like you're a female, you're doing sets of 10 at 25 kilos, we'll say. Progressing 2.5 kilos for you is a 10% increase. So that for you now, if you were to progress by 2.5 kilos every session, your progress would be 10 times greater than the person squatting 250 kilos and adding 2.5 kilos. So that's something to really think about, because it's like, oh, right. So when that person progresses, it's actually 10 times smaller than the progression that I'm making. And that kind of really puts progressive overload into context a bit more, because that person, the 250 kilo squatter who's progressing every session, he's probably doing something more in line with his adaptive capacity based on how he's training, the drugs he's using, his recovery capacity, his nutrition, etc. Versus the female who's squatting 25 kilos and trying to add 2.5 kilos every session. Unrealistic, not happening. Like, it's very unlikely that you have the capacity to adapt that fast for long periods of time, at least. If you're just new to the gym, you're learning the skill of the movement, you weren't previously skilled at the movement, then I would expect you to be adding weight relatively regularly up until a point where you hit some sort of plateau, and then it'll need to be a bit slower progress, okay? And this is why, sometimes people will use things like daily undulating periodization, okay? So maybe you do 6 reps, 8 reps, and 10 reps throughout the week, okay? So let's say you squat Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 6, 8, 10, okay? Then what they do, they do their 6 reps on Monday, and obviously that's going to be the heaviest load. Then they do 8 reps on Wednesday, it's going to be a slightly lighter load, and then 10 reps on Friday, and it's going to be a lighter load again, okay? So every time they go into the gym, there's this sort of novelty component, okay? Like, and yes, there may be muscular benefits and actual training adaptation benefits, but psychologically, that person is training 3 times per week with a novel stimulus every time, because it's a different rep range, a different feeling. And then if they do go into the gym the next week and they progress even by 1 rep on each of those days, then they're like, yes, I progressed, all right? But psychologically, it's very different to going in and doing, let's say, 8 reps Monday, 8 reps Wednesday, 8 reps Friday, and not progressing at all. Because they're going to be like, oh, fuck's sake, this is boring, I'm not progressing at all, I'm kind of just plateauing. That's a very different training experience psychologically to then go in the next week and, take your 1 rep, but then have to plateau for the next 2 sessions again. So 3 sessions of kind of plateauing again. And that's what's happening. Whereas when people do the daily undulating periodization strategy and they do like 6, 8, 10, what they then do is kind of, I suppose, disguise that lack of progress a little bit by creating novelty each time, and hence allow you to put in more effort, especially because you may not be revisiting that 6 rep range for another week and you're like, oh, I need to get the most out of this. Versus if you did 8 on 3 days and by the 3rd day you're like, I'm sick of lifting the same weight, okay? That happens, and we do have to think about what are the psychological implications of how I actually set up training and how I approach progressive overload, okay? So that's kind of a lot of what I wanted to bring up, and I just want to kind of reiterate the point that we are not trying to progressively overload the bar. We are trying to progressively overload the specific tension on the muscle fibers within the muscle that you are trying to train, okay? And that does not come about just by the addition of load, okay? And if you do want to increase your chances of the overload translating to hypertrophy, then you want to make sure that your technique is as clean as possible, that it's locked down, that you are not swinging, not using momentum, anything like that, because that's how you're going to be able to predict that you're going to gain muscle, okay? Because if you're just finding ways to move more efficiently, okay, whether that is using a little bit of momentum off your chest, whether it's bouncing out of the squat a bit more, hinging your hips back a bit more, if you're using those things as tools to aid you with progress, then any progress that you make is more difficult to be like, it's less likely that that's going to predict your gains in muscle. Okay, have to keep that in mind, guys. We really, really do. And what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh yeah, bit of a bold statement, but I think that it's not even a bold statement, like it's fairly obvious if you actually think about it, but you should be looking at how are your isolation movements progressing, okay? They, I'm going to say, will be the most predictive of progress in terms of muscle hypertrophy. Because if your isolation movements are progressing over time, then you can be sure that there are muscular adaptations going on, okay? Because there's less skill, there's less complexity, there's less neurological adaptation involved in those movements. Sure, there is to a degree, but there's less involved. So if you see that your like strict cable chest fly has increased by a few kilos over the course of a year, you can be like, I've probably made some chest gains. Whereas your bench press, if you're like, you know, if you're coming down and maybe you're using a bit more momentum, or maybe you've improved your skill, you've changed your technique throughout the year, or maybe your triceps got stronger, your shoulders got stronger, you got better at retracting. If it was one of those things, like you can't be entirely sure. You can't be entirely sure that did my chest, was this all chest development that came from that increase in the bench press? Like it's not that it's not a good predictor. It is, but it's just that your isolation movements are probably greater predictors. The same on something like a leg extension. If your leg extension is progressing, you're building tolerance, you're able to do 12 reps with your previous 6 rep max. Like you can be fairly sure that, okay, I know my quadriceps have adapted, and provided I've been, you know, consuming enough protein, consuming enough calories, that has probably translated into me gaining a bit more muscle. And you can be like, yes. Whereas your squat, it's like, was it my glutes? Was it my adductors? Was it a change in technique? Was it a bit of momentum? So don't dismiss those isolation movements, but don't also miss what I'm trying to say either, because some people will listen to that and say, oh, Gary said that isolation movements are better for hypertrophy. No, I said they're better predictors of whether or not you are progressing with respect to hypertrophy. And I think this is actually a mistake that people make as well. They only progress certain movements, they only try to progress their compound movements. And why is that? If we come back to the discussion again, it's because it's easier. It's because it's easier because there's more weight being lifted, and because we think in kilograms, it's easier to add weight to the bar without it being as much of a relative change, okay? And also because it's easier to find ways to kind of cheat your way through or sneak in an extra other rep that you didn't really own where the technique was quite poor. So remember this now. There are no progressive overload movements. There are no exercises that are better for progressive overload. That doesn't make sense, okay? All that means is that the person is able to greater see externally an increase in the load on the bar. That's all that means, that it's easier to see a greater external increase in the load on the bar. It does not mean that there's a greater ability for you to increase the internal tension on the actual musculature, because that could be as simple as you adjusting your technique and being able to have greater intent, greater stability, even if the weight isn't increasing. You could increase your tension on the actual muscle that way, as opposed to just adding weight onto the bar. So there are no progressive overload movements. That's a silly thing that people kind of say, because again, it gives them that external validation. It's like, oh, thank God, you know, the bar is making me feel like I've progressed, even though I don't feel like I've gained any muscle. It's like, you know, that's what actually matters. And we're trying to progress our muscle mass. Yes, we should be seeing those compound movements going up over time with our technique staying completely strict. We should be seeing our leg extensions, our leg curls, our chest flies, our bicep curls. We should be seeing those things going up, even if it's just by a rep or two, here and there, every couple of months. Same on like a lateral raise. If you get an extra 2 or 3 reps by the end of the year, it's like, good work, you know? That's an extra 2 or 3 reps across whatever 8 sets you do throughout the week with 5 kilos on a very long lever that is, you know, being countered by a very short muscle. It's like, that's good progress, man. That's a lot of cumulative tension that you've been putting there, and that you've then been feeding that protein synthetic response with sufficient protein, sufficient calories, sufficient sleep, etc. It's like, you're probably going to make some good progress from that. What you're not going to make such good progress from is starting really strict on your deadlift, perfect form, good control, and then by the end of your training cycle, just rounding your back and completely just fucking it, you know? That's not what is the route to progress, even if it's an extra 20 kilos in the bar. So keep that in mind, guys. I am mindful that the progressive overload thing is a loaded discussion. So I want you guys to ask some questions, if possible. Drop them in the Facebook comments below, and then I'll make a follow-up video, because I think there are always going to be questions left over for something that is so important for your training. So yeah, hopefully you found that helpful. I'm trying to think if there was anything else that I wanted to add. I don't think there was. Yeah, no, that'll do me. Have a great day, guys.